project's called From Policies to People, the Indian Reorganization Act at Warm Springs Reservation. First, I would like to thank Myra and Wilson and Shailene, who are probably here. My class had the opportunity to go on a field trip to Warm Springs Reservation, and we sat with them over 2 days for probably like 10 hours and asked questions, and they answered, and it was a really, really wonderful, humbling, but also just really interesting experience, and I'm really grateful for that. On the right-hand side, that's a picture of a photo from a hike I took during that field trip. And then on the left-hand side, I guess yours is right-hand side, that is Warm Springs Reservation within Greater Oregon. So, as I mentioned, my research examines the relationship between the United States federal government and the Confederated Tribes at Warm Springs in the 1930s. The 1930s was when the Federal Indian Reorganization Act was passed in 1934. It was a piece of legislation that John Koehler wrote and brought to the federal government. John Koehler was like a social reformer, was also the Commissioner of Indian Affairs between 1933 and 1938, I believe. And the Federal Indian Reorganization Act was a piece of legislation that, according to the federal government, was supposed to bring certain rights back to Indian reservations with a focus on sort of autonomy. And so what happened was that it was supposed to give sort of a framework for individual tribes to write their own charters and construct their own charters. And yesterday when I was practicing this speech, Wilson and I had a conversation, and he said, you know, the community at Warm Springs, we already had all that. The federal government wasn't giving us anything. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind, that you have to let federal legislation come in with a grain of salt, because from his perspective, the multiple bands and tribes that were present at Warm Springs in the 1930s already were their own, they had autonomy. They had their own language, they had their own culture, they had their own history, and they've been organizing as communities for thousands of years. And to him and to that population, that's what being sovereign meant, and that's what autonomy meant. And so trying to figure out how you, I guess my project is focused on how you highlight sort of that sense of autonomy within a piece of federal legislation. So here is that demonstrated. I demonstrate in this paper how the community of Warm Springs exercise self-determination to construct the charter and reorganize both physical and social parts of their community infrastructure in order to benefit from, not just adjust to, the changing federal structure. These actions show the community's active, cohesive cooperation and community. And how I've kind of gone about doing that is, first of all, reading secondary source research, you know, what John Koehler was writing about and sort of the philosophies that he was coming from. And there's a ton of that. You can read about John Koehler's life for days and not run out of people that have written about him. But another way that I've gone about that is to kind of look into primary source research and see what sorts of documents were being exchanged in the 1930s to and from Warm Springs. And asking myself, sort of, what patterns can I get from those documents? Do the activities delineated in the documents show residents asserting a new sense of autonomy? Do the conversations outlined in the letters acknowledge the Indian Reorganization Act or hint at it? So how is it being received at Warm Springs Reservation? And I guess these questions sort of, to me, I'm coming at this, I'm an amateur. I didn't really know anything about the history at Warm Springs, the particular history of Warm Springs before 10 weeks ago. So I'm asking a lot of questions. So then looking at interpreting primary source research, these two quotes were found in a survey of conditions of the Indians. So it's actually a court case, a federal level court case, but this particular section was at Warm Springs. And on the right side, you have Mr. Kuka, who actually, his name was spelled wrong in the document, and Wilson helped me correct it, so thank you. He is talking about, this is 1931, he's talking about the way that money from the federal government given to the Warm Springs Reservation was being distributed, and sort of the filters that it had to go through before it reached citizens of the community. And so he's saying, regarding the money, we ought to have a voice in it to help out in making a program as to show how the money should be spent. And this is in 1931, before the Indian Reorganization Act, as a member of the community speaking for the community, talking about asking for the Indian Reorganization Act. And so I think that's important to look at, because you have, what I read was John Koehler kind of exploring, he went to Taos and went to New Mexico, and that's where I read the Indian Reorganization Act came from, was John Koehler going to Taos and helping the Native community there. But here you have someone from Warm Springs asking for it as well. And then on the right side is a quote about Mr. Perkins is a senator, and he's talking about regulation of resources on Warm Springs, and just coming at it from like a very controlling, regulatory tone. Continue the survey of conditions, just looking at how Perry Cookup was sort of challenged and discouraged during the court case. So senators telling him to make it brief, even though the court case was probably like 40 pages long. And then looking at the charter after 1938 and seeing like if I could see changes in documents that might indicate that that might hint that people are recognizing the charter. So there's a superintendent, so a guy from the federal government, talking about how since 1938 a market awakening has taken place, and you always have to be pretty suspicious about that kind of language. But then looking at it from documents that were actually written by the Warm Springs tribe, and there's a resolution in 1938 that sort of delineates a relationship between the community at Warm Springs and the federal government. And that's a relationship that is being delineated from the side of the community at Warm Springs. So the community is saying public officials should be elected by the community and not put in place by the federal government. So after election, we go. And then I just wanted to highlight sort of like organizing verbs or call to action. So the tribal council called, noticed, convened, and held this day, the 9th of August, 1938, that the foregoing resolution would be duly adopted by the affirmative vote of 8 members. And it seems kind of silly to point those out, but they're verbs and they show action, and that's important. And then closing remarks. I think one of the most important things, and I'm actually just beginning to process this, is that the charter wasn't adopted until 1938, but the federal legislation passed in 1934, and between that time was like a lot of the community at Warm Springs deliberating and deciding how they wanted to take that legislation. And Wilson was telling me how they felt like the federal government was trying to sort of push a very like general outline charter down their throats, and they really wanted to write their own charter and make it fit Warm Springs, and that was difficult because at that time, not all of the community spoke English, and so having to translate words and go through that process, and it wasn't rare to have a tribal council meeting that started at 5 p.m. and ended at 10 a.m. the next morning. And so that itself just shows how much work the community put into the sort of legislation. And that's not to say that it was successful, so thank you.